move forward with the next section for today's session, that is how to create a web application using Spring Boot. Now, all of us work with web applications on a day-to-day basis, but how do we start creating it? So let's take a look at how do we start creating the web application using Spring Boot. Now, to create a web application using Spring Boot, you have to follow a few steps. Now, the steps are basically what would be the controller, what you would request on URL, and what should be returned. So these are the main three questions that have to be answered. That is, what is your request URL, what has to be returned, and what is the controller. So let's get started and see how we can create a web application, right? So for that, I'll shift back to my Eclipse IDE, and then I've closed all the files so that there's no further confusion, right? And now what I'll do is I'll go to file over here, go to new, and let's say I create a new project, right? In the new project, let's say I'll mention the name to be web app, right? So I'll just mention courses web apps. Let's work on courses. And again, we have to check our group ID, artifact ID, version, and so on. So here, I'm not going to change the description and all. And then I'll just click on next. Once I click on next, this is one of the most important things that you have to consider in a web application. Since we're making a web application, we basically need the web dependency, right? So I'll just search for web dependency. And then you see that, we have the Spring Web, the reactive web, and the web services, right? So what I'll do is I'll just click over here. I'll choose the Spring Web. I'll choose the Spring Web services. We can also choose Jersey. Well, it's completely your call what dependencies that you want. Well, for this particular application, we need the Spring Web. But for your understanding, I'm using the Spring Web services and Jersey also, but just in case. And after that, I'll click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, you'll see that, the project is getting created. So let's just wait for that to happen. All right, so as you can see, my project has been created, and then we have a main folder in which the package name is demo, and then we have the main application file folder, that is the courses web application. Now, what I'm going to do in this particular application is that I'm going to create a web application using the JSP files. Nowadays, I would say that, not everybody is using JSP files, and most of us are using the REST APIs and the REST methods and other files. But I would say to make you understand a simple application, JSP is the best thing that we can use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a JSP file first. So before I do that, if you see on my left hand side, I have a source folder, and then inside that I have a main folder. So over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder, and inside that particular folder, I'm going to put the JSP file, right? So I'll just right click over here, go to new. Let's say I choose folder, and let's say I mention the folder name to be web app, right? And then I'll click on finish. And inside this particular folder, I'll go to new again, and then I'll choose file. And in these files, what I'll do is I'll basically search for the JSP files, right? So I'm not going to search presently. What I'll just mention is I'll mention courses.jsp, and then I'll click on finish. Once I click on courses.jsp, you see that, automatically the JSP file gets created. But yes, we do not see few files. So let's just right click over here, go to new, and then let's create the file again. Right, so I'll just search for JSP over here. Okay, so we have the JSP over here. I'll click on next, and then let's say we mention the file name to be courses, and okay, it says courses exists, so I'll just mention it to be course, and then I'll click on finish. Right, so once I click on finish, you see that, automatically the JSP file has been created. So what I'll do is I'll just delete this part so that there's no confusion further, and then we have this particular file, that is course.jsp. Now, once the course.jsp file has been created, this is basically our view. So if you remember in the theory part, I was talking about the model view controller. So our JSP file is basically the view, that is basically what the user sees. The model is basically how we are building the model, and the controller is where we decide what request has to be sent and what will be the response that the user sees. So basically what happens is that, the request goes to the controller, and then the controller calls this particular file, that is the courses.jsp file. So now if you observe in our project, we do not have a controller. Now, if you're not working on Spring Boot, and maybe if you were working on any other technologies, then creating a controller takes quite amount of time. But when it comes to Spring Boot, you can just directly create the controller by just creating a new class. So for that, I'll go to the package, and then I'll right click over there, and then I'll choose class, right? And over here, let's say I mentioned the class name to be courses controller, right? Well, the class name actually doesn't matter. You can mention whatever that you want to mention, and then I'll just click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, we basically need a method to display the output. So to do that, I'll just create a method. Let's say public void, and let's say courses, and inside that, let's say I mention system.out.println, print ln, and inside that I'll mention welcome to Edureka, right? So what we basically are doing is that, we're just creating a method just to display the output. So basically, whenever the controller accepts the request and the request is taken forward, we want to display an output that, welcome to Edureka. The only problem over here is that, still this is just a class. It's not a controller, right? So the Spring Boot doesn't identify this particular class as a controller unless you use the @controller annotation. So to do that, you basically have to type in @controller, right? And then you have to just import the required library. Now, once you've put the @controller annotation, Spring Boot automatically identifies this particular class as the controller class. Now, the problem over here is that, we do not know what the request is and we have not passed any request. So we just know what the output will be, that is welcome to Edureka. We've created a JSP page and then we've not configured anything in that till now, but we have to configure the request, right? So to configure the request, basically what we'll do is we'll use the @request mapping annotation, and then we'll just mention /courses, right? So whenever we see this request of /courses on our local host, we see that, automatically this particular output has to be printed, that is welcome to Edureka. Now to run any web application, what happens is that, you need a server. So basically what happens is that in Spring Boot, we have an embedded Tomcat server. So you do not have to configure it separately. You have an embedded Tomcat server which is present. So if you want to check, you can just go to the Maven dependencies and then you see Tomcat embedded code, Tomcat embedded WebSocket, and so on. So basically all our servers have been configured automatically, right? So when you start the application, right? So whenever you wish to start the application, you'll see an output that, Tomcat started on port number, whatever you configure, right? So what I'll do is I'll basically you configure the port first so that, we move forward and see what happens when we execute the application, right? So I'll go to the main resources file. I'll go to application properties. I'll mention server.port. Let's say I go to a different port, let's say 8083, right? I'll click on save. And then what I'll do is I'll just execute this particular application. I'll right click over here, go to run as, and choose Spring Boot app, right? I'll click on OK. And then once I click on OK, you see that, automatically our execution has started, right? So let's just wait for the execution to be finished. And once we see the execution is done, we see that, Tomcat started on port number 8083. That means our server has started and the application has started. So what I'll do is I'll go to the port 8083 / and I'll mention courses. All right, now we see an error over here. Why do you think the error might have come? That is because, we haven't mapped the JSP file to be returned when we use this particular URL. So whenever a client sends this particular request, that is localhost :8083 /courses, we wanted the courses JSP file to be returned, right? But, there was no mapping that had happened for that. So for that, what we'll do is we'll go back to our file, right? And then I'll go back to my courses controller, right? And over here, I'll mention return, and I'll mention course.jsp. That is basically our file name. All right, so as we can see, there's an error that, we cannot return when the method is void, right? So I'll just change it to string, right? And then you see that, the error goes, right? Now let's say, we execute the project, right? So I'll just relaunch this particular project. So I'll right click over here, go to run as, and then I'll choose Spring Boot app, right? And then I'll click on OK, and let's see what happens. All right, it says that, Tomcat has started on port number 8083 and the application has started. So let's just open our localhost :8083. All right, we see that, there's nothing happening on the localhost side. And then we see there was an unexpected error, type not found 404 status. So that is because, Spring Boot still doesn't know that, how to convert a JSP file to a servlet. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop executing this particular application. And then what I'll do is I'll go to the pom.xml file, and then I'll have to include the Jasper dependency. So let me just open the pom.xml file, right? I'll just drag this down. I'll go to the official website, let's say Maven repository, and then I'll search for Jasper, right? And then I'll just click over here, and then you see a lot of versions of it, right? So we do not know which version has to be used. So for that, what we'll do is we'll go to the Maven dependencies, and then we see that, the Tomcat embedded is of 9.0.24. So we'll go for the same one, right? So we'll go for 9.0.24. So I'll just select over here, And then I'll just copy this particular section of the code, right? I'll go back to my Eclipse file and then I'll just paste it over here. Right now, once this is done, you're basically showing the Spring Boot how to convert a JSP file to a servlet. Now what we're going to do is let's just relaunch this particular application and let's just drag this. So once I drag, we see that the Tomcat has started on port number 8083 again. So I'll just say courses, and then once I execute, you see that it's a blank page. That's because we haven't configured the JSP file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to stop the execution, right? And then I'll go to the JSP file. I'm going to drag this down, and let's say I mention top selling courses are, and then I mention DevOps, Python, Big Data, AWS, and RPA, right? So we can do like, let's put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And then over here in the insert title, I'll just mention Edureka courses. I'll just save this file, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to execute this file again. So I'll just relaunch this application. And then once I relaunch this application, let's just wait for the output. So as soon as I relaunch this application, you see Tomcat has started. So I'll just refresh this particular page, and we see that top selling courses are DevOps, Python, Big Data, AWS, and RPA, and the title has also changed, right? So that means our course.jsp file has been returned. Now if you observe over here, if I just remove this particular section and then if I put @response body, so if I just put in this @response body annotation, let's see what happens. I'll just import the required libraries for this. My bad, I put it in a wrong place. What we have to do is we have to mention it after request mapping, right? So I'll just mention it over here, and then I'll import the required libraries, right? And let's see what happens, right? So I'll just relaunch this particular application again. All right, now once I've relaunched this application, let's just refresh this particular page, and then you see that course.jsp. Well, this was a JSP file's name, right? So what basically happens with response body is that whatever you're going to see over here is basically the data, and it is not going to return a web page, right? So whenever you want to return a specific data, then you use the response body annotation. Else you do not use the response body annotation, and then if you want to just return a web page, then you just use the request mapping annotation to just map the URL and then send back. Well guys, this was how you can create a web application. Well, this was a really simple web application that I had created. I just created a simple JSP file in which I had mentioned the body to be a specific set of lines, and then what I did was I created a controller. So in the controller, I sent a request mapping /courses, and then I said whenever this particular URL is sent, we have to return the course.jsp file. So the course.jsp file is basically a view, and the controller is a controller, and the model is basically how you put in the structure of the project. So guys, that's how you can basically create a simple web application. Now, before I close this section, let's say you do not want to mention course.jsp, but you just want to mention course, right? So that's where the application properties file comes into the picture. I'm just going to kill this process, and then I'll just close over here. And then what I'll do is I'll change it to course, and then in the application properties file, what you have to mention is basically spring.mvc.view, and then in the prefix you have to mention the folder name. That was basically our web app folder. So if you see, I have the web app folder which has the web pages, right? That is all the JSP files, right? So I'll just mention prefix / and I'll mention web app. Now after that, basically I want to identify the course.jsp file, right? So I have to again mention the suffix also. So similarly, what I'll do is I'll just copy this particular part. I'll just paste it over here, and then I'll mention suffix equal to, and then I'll mention JSP, right? So this will be in dot because the file name is filename.jsp, right? So that's because that's the reason. So the prefix will be /webapp, that is basically the folder name, and the suffix will be .jsp. Now I'll just save this particular file. I'll relaunch this application, and then let's see what happens. All right, so we can see that the Tomcat has started. So let's go back to our localhost. All right, it says that localhost 8083, there's no mapping to it. All right, so my bad, you have to put another slash at the end also. That's because it's a directory, right? So you have to say A/B/C because it's a set of folders. That is Inside source, there was main. Inside main, there's web app, and inside web app, we have course.jsp, right? So you need a slash at the end also. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to relaunch this application again, and let's see again if we get the output or not. So I'll just click on OK. All right, so once I click on OK, you can see that, Tomcat has started. So I'll just refresh this particular page. And again, we see that, the application has no explicit mapping, right? So what I'm going to do is I'll just check what's going wrong. So let me just go back to the controller, right? And in the controller, what I'll do is I'll just change it to courses over here. Or let's say I change it to course. That doesn't matter so. And then I'll again relaunch the application. Let's see what's the issue. Let's see if we execute. Okay, there's an error still. So I think the error is with the folder. So let's just create a new folder over here. Let's say I mention it to be web pages, right? And inside that, I'm going to put the course.jsp file, right? And in the application properties, what I'll do is I'll just change it to web pages, right? I'll just save, and then my bad, it was course, right? I'll just relaunch this particular application. We see that, Tomcat has started on port 8083 and then on course. Let's just refresh. All right, once I refresh, you see that, we get the output as top selling courses are DevOps, Python, Big Data, AWS, and RPA, right? So the main problem over here that was I hadn't created a folder name that was web pages. So basically we are trying to put the JSP file inside the folder, right? So that's what we have to do. So I had directly taken the web app folder, but that's not the way to do. You have to create another folder in which you'll put the JSP files, and also in the controller file you have to remove the .jsp suffix for the file, and then you have to mention in the request mapping to be /course, or in fact you go back to your courses, right? So it's not a big deal. It's completely based on your text that you want to mention. So I hope this part is clear. So with this, guys, I wrap up this particular part of the session. Now let's say, you want to create a web application to pass the client's data, right? So obviously it's not always that, we have specific data that is already predefined, right? Sometimes it may also happen that, we want to pass the client data into an application, right? So let's see how to do that. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to extend this particular project that we have just created, that is the courses project. But before that, let me just close everything so that there's no confusion again, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close the pom.xml file, and then we have the web application, the course.jsp, the course controller, and the application properties. Now, what was happening till now was that, we sent a URL /courses, and wherever /courses had been sent, we return a JSP file that is course.jsp, right? Now, in the course.jsp, I had mentioned this particular data. Now, what we want to do is basically we want to pass the client's data. For example, let's say, I want to mention my name, Sahiti. So if I want to mention my name, so in URLs, how you mention your name is basically, you have a URL, let's say localhost colon 8083/courses, and then what happens is you mention question mark, and then you mention name equal to Sahiti, right? Now, once this particular name has been mentioned over here, what we want to do is we want to make sure that, we get the name over here that is in the JSP file. So how do you think that we can do that? Well, that is really simple. We just have to use the servlet request option. That is basically the HTTP servlet request dispatcher, right? So what I'm going to do is in the JSP file, initially, I'm just going to mention welcome to Edureka. And then what I'm going to do is in the course controller file, what I'm going to mention over here is basically that, public string courses. And over here, I'll mention HTTP servlet request, right? And then I'll mention an object, let's say REQ. Now, what I'm basically doing is that, when I mention this name Sahiti over here, we are passing the name to the server, but nothing's happening on the server side, right? So basically, we have no method to basically accept the request from the client and then process the request. Well, to do that, we have to configure the controller, and that's the reason I've mentioned the servlet request over here. As soon as to pass the data in the URL, automatically that particular data has been fetched from over here, and then the required actions are taken into account. So what I've done is I've mentioned HTTP servlet request REQ, and then I'll just import the required package. And over here, what I'm trying to do is that, I'm telling the Spring to automatically connect the request to the right object. And when we have the right object, we just have to fetch it, right? So that's what we're trying to do over here. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just mentioning HTTP servlet request. And then what I'll do is I'll just fetch this particular request. So I'll just mention string, let's say course name equal to, and then I'll mention request dot get parameter, right? And over here again I'll mention, let's say course name. I'm sorry, let's put it in small letters. that is course name. Right, so the course name sounds a big name for URL, so I'll just mention CNAME, right? And over here also I'll just mention CNAME, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'll just close. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to close the bracket. All right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to relaunch this particular application, right? So let's just relaunch this particular application and let's see what happens. Once I relaunch this application, let's just say we mention the course name to be DevOps, and then I'll click on enter. Now, once I click on enter, we see that, we get redirected to our JSP page that is welcome to Edureka. But what we wanted was basically a course name to be displayed also, right? So to do that, what we're going to do is I'm going to go back to my Eclipse IDE over here. And then what I'll do is I'll mention system.out.println, and brackets I'll mention the course name is, let's say, colon, and then we'll use the object that we just created, that was CNAME. Oh, I'm sorry, the spelling is wrong, right? And then I'll just save this particular file. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to relaunch this particular application, right? So let's just relaunch. Right, after relaunching, if we refresh this particular application, you see that, there's no change in the output. That was because, we haven't configured the JSP file to accept the object, right? So we have configured the controller to fetch the object, but yes, the object doesn't store the data that the client is still passing, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the HTTP session request. So what I'm going to do is I'll just put an enter over here and I'll type in HTTP, let's say session. Let's give the name session equal to request dot get session. And then I'll just close this particular bracket and then I'll import the HTTP session, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the session object, right? So I'll just use session dot set attribute, and in the name I'll mention CNAME, right? And value also I'll mention CNAME, right? So let's just mention that. And the name should be in string, guys, so I'll mention in double quotes, right? And then what I'll do is I'll go back to my JSP file, and over here I'll just mention welcome to Edureka. And then what I'll do is I'll just put // so that is space, and then we'll just mention dollar, and in flower brackets we'll mention CNAME, right? So that means that, automatically our course name will be printed over here. Now, after that is done, what I'll do is I'll just basically relaunch our application, right? So I'll just save this file and let's just relaunch the application. All right, so as you can see, Tomcat has started. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over here and then I'll refresh this particular page. And when I refresh this particular page, you can see that, we passed the course name to be DevOps, and then DevOps got printed over here. For example, let's say I mention RPA. So automatically it will change to RPA. So that's how, guys, basically you can pass the client data to a web application. Now, if you observe over here, we hadn't got this output of, system.out.println where the course name is CNAME, right? So that was because, we've already used the session object where, the session object sets the attribute for the CNAME that is taken from the URL, and then it is returned to the JSP file, which finally shows the output to the user. So I don't think this is necessary. Also, you can just remove this part and you can just comment out and try to execute again. Right, so that's how, guys, basically you can pass the client's data to a web application. I hope you've understood how to create a web application and also how to pass a client's data to a web application. So now that you know how to pass a client's data in web application, let's move forward with the session and understand an example on the model view and object. Now, if you remember in the theory part, I was talking about the model view controller, right? So basically where we have a model view and a controller and how these three components collaborate with each other. So let's look into the same on the practical side of how you can use a model view and object. But before that, let me just switch back to my Eclipse workspace. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop this process. And now before I move forward, I hope you've understood that we're fetching a name from the client and then we're adding it to a session and then we're displaying the output on the JSP file, right? But let's say, we want to accept the course name without using the HTTP session or, without using the HTTP servlet request. Do you think that can happen? Well, I would say it could definitely happen. So to do that, what you can basically do is that, you can basically remove this part, right? And then what you can just do is you just have to mention string name, right? So whatever data that we are getting from the client, we're basically storing in this particular variable, that is the string name, or you can just say the course name, right? So over here, I'm just getting all the data, that is basically all the client data, and I'm storing it in this particular variable. Now, since we're not using the REQ object, so what we're going to do is I'm just going to remove this particular part and also this particular part where I'm getting the parameter. Now, the reason is basically we're already getting data from the client side in this particular method, that is basically the string CNAME. But yet we have to get the session data, right? So that is basically, since it's in our URL, so we still have to use HTTP session over here, and then we'll mention session. And then what you can do is you can just save this file and then reload this particular application, right? So now once you reload this particular application, let's see what the output comes as, right? So I'll just reload this particular application, and then you see an output that, welcome to Edureka RPA. Now you see that, there's no change in the URL, there's no change in the output, and there's no change at all, right? That's because, we are again doing the same thing, but the only difference is that, we're not using the HTTP request servlet, request body, and the response body. But yet we are using a string CNAME, basically where all the client data is getting stored in this particular CNAME from the session data. Now let's say, you change the course's CNAME to, let's say, CNAMEs, right? Do you think it's going to work? Well, I would say no, it's not going to work. It's just going to print welcome to Edureka, and it's not going to print what is passed by the client data, that is RPA. Now, don't you think this is a very big problem? This is, right? Because we cannot be reliable on CNAME. Let's say, instead of CNAME, let's say, I have course name, right? And then obviously I'll have to change it to course name over here. And then let's say I relaunch this application once again. Now, once I relaunch this application, let's see what happens. Again, I would say that, you will not get any output, and you'll just get welcome to Edureka. And then you will not see an output of, the course name passed by the client, right? So if I just reload this particular page, you see just welcome to Edureka. But yes, if I just type it to course name, so if I just change the URL to course name, and I type RPA, you see that, welcome to Edureka RPA. So that's basically a very big problem, guys. So to avoid that, what we have to do is we have to use the @request param annotation, right? So to do that, what we're going to do is we'll just mention @request param, right? And then what I'm going to do is in brackets, I'm going to mention, this has to be inside the bracket, right? And over here, what I'll mention is CNAME. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to import the required library for this particular annotation. Now, let's say we relaunch this application again. All right, we see that, Tomcat has started. So I'll just refresh this, and then you see that, at course name, it's not working. But again, if I mention CNAME, you'll see that, the URL will be working. So basically, that's the thing, guys. What we are doing over here is that, we are seeing the request param to be CNAME. So whenever the request parameter is CNAME, whatever is passed in the course name, basically whatever is passed in the URL automatically gets stored in the course name, and then the output is displayed. But the problem over here is that, let's say you do not want to use the session data itself. You do not want to use HTTP session, and then you obviously do not want to set an attribute for session, right? How do you think you can do that? Yet you want the data to be passed, and then you want the data to be retrieved and displayed in the output. How do you think you can do that? Well, you can definitely do that by using the model and view, right? So in model and view basically comes the dispatcher servlet concept, where I told you that, dispatcher servlet basically needs two things, that is data and the view name, right? So that's the thing that you have to pass. So instead of, public string courses over here, what we can do is we can just change it to model and view, right? So I'll just mention model and view. That's a special type of class, right? And then what you can do is we can just remove this part of session data, right? And then I'll just remove this particular part also. And then what I'll do is I'll just mention model and view. Let's say I mention MV equal to, I'll mention new, and then I'll mention model and view. After that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an object, right? So in model and view, what happens is that, you have to add an object, and then you have to set the view name, right? So I'm just going to make sure I use the object name, that is MV, and I'll choose add object, and the attribute value, I'll just mention CNAME, right? Comma, and the value will be again course name, right? So that's what we had mentioned over here. In the request param, it was CNAME, and in the string, it was course name, right? So that's what I'm going to mention over here. And after that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically set the view name. So I'll again use mv dot set view name. And let's say over here, I'll return the JSP file, that is the course file, right? So I'll just mention course, and then I'll just remove this particular section of the code. Now, after that, what you have to do is you have to return the object itself, right? So I'll just type in return MV. right? So you're basically adding an object and then you're setting the view name for it. And then what you have to do is you have to return. So you're basically creating a model view object, that is MV. And then for that, you're adding an object of CD, that is basically where our course name is getting stored. And then what you're doing is you're setting a view name, that is where the JSP file will be shown as an output. Now, once that is done, let's just relaunch this particular application. All right, so as you can see, Tomcat has started on port number 8080. So I'll just refresh this particular page, and then you see that, we get the CNAME to be RPA. Similarly, if I just type in DevOps, you see, welcome to Edureka DevOps. So guys, that was an example about the model view object. I hope you've understood how you can add an object and set a view name. With that, we come to an end to this particular section of the session. Now moving on in the session, we'll be creating a submission form in Spring Boot, right? So this is one of the most common use cases in Spring Boot to understand the database dependency and how a client can enter details, and also how the details can be stored and maybe fetched from the database. So without any further ado, let's get started with how to create a submission form in Spring Boot, right? Now to create a submission form in Spring Boot, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close all this part. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a submission form, right? So for that, let's just create a new project altogether. So I'll go to File, I'll go to New, I'll choose Spring Starter Project. Let's say I mention the name to be Submission Forms, and then I'll click on Next. Once I click on Next, I'm going to choose the required dependency. So according to me, I think the required dependencies are basically H2 database, Spring Data JPA, Jersey, I think web services, because we need web services and web. And after that, I'm just going to click on Finish. Once I click on Finish, you can see that, our project is getting created. So let's just wait for that to happen. And once the project is created, you can see that, automatically we get this file, that is the application file. Now what we can do is we can just create a new class, let's say customer. So I'll go to New and I'll choose Class and I'll mention Customers. And then I'll click on Finish. Now in this particular class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mention few parameters like, customer name, customer ID, and customer email. So let me just mention private int CID. Let's say private int CNAME and private int, the private spelling, and let's say C email. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to generate the getter setter method. So I'll select all of them. I'll right click, I'll go to source and I'll choose generate getter setter methods. So I'll select all and then I'll click on generate. Now after everything is done, I'll just copy these two and then put it over here so that there's no confusion. Now after that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click over here and then I'm going to go to source and then I'll just convert generate to string. So I'll mention CID, CNAME, and CEmail, and then I'll click on generate, right? So automatically as I click on generate, this particular section gets generated. So I'll just copy from over here and then I'll paste it over here, right? So it's basically converted to string, right? Now what we're going to do is we're basically trying to create a web application, or it's a submission form, right? So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the source folder over here. Then I'll go to main. I'll create a new, say, folder, and in the folder I'll mention the name, let's say web app, right? I'll click on finish, and in the web app folder I'll create a new JSP file, right? So I'll go to new, I'll go to other, I'll search for JSP. I'll get the JSP file tag. I'll go to next. Let's say I mentioned the JSP file name to be Edureka, and then I'll click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, you automatically see that, we get a JSP file. Now over here, what we basically have to do is we have to basically mention the actions and the inputs. So what I'm going to do is in the body section, I'm going to mention the form action to be, let's say, add customers. So I'm going to add the customers. I'm just going to extend this form section, and in the input section, right? So in the input, I'm going to give an input of the customer ID, customer name, and email ID, right? So basically these are three inputs that I want the users to give or submit in the form so that the customer can be added, right? So I'll just mention input type equal to, let's say, text, and then I'll mention name equal to CID. Similarly, I'll give a break so that we get a break. Then I'll mention CNAME and email ID, right? So I'll just copy paste them and CEmail. Now after that is done, what I want is I basically want a submit button, right? So that the user can submit it, right? So what for that, I'm going to just mention again the same thing, that is input type equal to submit, right? So I'll just mention over here submit and I'll remove everything, right? So I'll just mention, sorry, it should be inside the quotes. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this file. So that's with the JSP file. Now, if you remember in the model view controller, I said we need a controller, right? So this is basically our view. We need a controller also, right? So let's just create the controller. But before that, I'll just mention the title to be Edureka customers, right? So that will be basically our form title, right? Now what I'll do is I'll go back to my package. I'll right click over here. And then what I'll do is I'll choose a class. And let's say I create the class name to be form controller, right? And then I click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, you see that, automatically we get the form controller file. Now, what I want to basically do over here is give the request mapping on that, on what request shall the edureka.jsp file be returned. So to do that, what I'm going to initially do is I'm going to tell the Spring Boot that, this particular class, that is the form controller, is the controller. So for that, we'll use the controller annotation, right? And then I'll just import the required packages. After that, what I'm going to do is I'll mention @request mapping, and over here I'll mention a method which says public string, let's say edureka, and in brackets I'll mention return edureka.jsp. Now after this is done, I'll just import the required packages for request mapping, and then you see the error is gone. Now, one thing, if you remember in the previous example also where I was creating a web application, I told you that, we have to tell Spring how to convert the JSP files to a servlet. So for that, we need the Jasper dependency. So as I had previously opened also, so we're going to copy this particular dependency. And then what I'm going to do is I'll go to my form.xml file, and then I'll just paste it over here. Well, these were the similar steps that we had done in the previous examples also. So that's what we have done. So basically, I'll just close this part. Now let's say, I'm going to configure the application properties file. So what I'll do is I'll go to the submission forms folder, and then over here, I'll just configure the application properties file. Let's say server.port equal to 8084. I'll just click on save, and then I'll just launch this particular project. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm launching the other project. So I'll just close the process, right? And then what I'll do is I'll right click on this particular project, go to run as, and choose Spring Boot app. So once I choose Spring Boot app, we see an output that, Tomcat has started on the port 8084. So what I'm going to do is, as we can see that we have given the form controller that the request mapping should be /, right? So basically whatever happens, so we'll go to port number 8084. And then we'll just give a / and see what we get as an output. We see 3 boxes to enter customer ID, customer name, and customer email ID, and then we get a submit button. Now, but the thing over here is that, it's just a simple thing that we had done previously also, that just to create a web application. Now, let's just create the same form in a more interesting way using more JSP files. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop this particular section over here. Right, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit few files. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm initially going to delete this customers.java class. Well, I'm doing that just to create the submission form in a more interesting manner, so that we get a hand of how to create more interesting web applications, right? So I'll just delete this part over here. So we basically have form controller and submission form applications. Now in the web app folder, I have edureka.jsp. Now what I'm going to do over here is that I'm going to create a new folder. Let's say I mentioned the folder name to be pages, and then I'll click on finish. And then what I'll do is I'll put the edureka.jsp file inside this particular pages folder. Now after that, what I'm going to do is I'll basically configure that, all the JSP files must be read from this particular folder, that is the pages folder. So for that, what we'll do is we'll search for prefix. And then we can see that, we get this option of spring.mvc.view.prefix. And over here, I'll mention the directory name, that is /pages/. Similarly, in the suffix one, since the files end with a JSP tag, I'll just mention suffix, right? And then what I'll do is I'll mention .jsp, right? And then I'll click on save. So that's with the configuration of the application properties file. Now what I'll do is I'll go back to my form controller, and then over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this annotation of get mapping. So initially the project workflow will be basically that, when I mention a specific URL, the edureka.jsp file must be returned. So in this particular file, I'm going to provide details in such a way that, the user can mention the customer ID, name, and email ID. After that is done, what is going to happen is that, the customer can view his details, right? So after the customer hits on the submit button, the customer must be redirected to a different page from where he can view the customer details. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to initially edit the edureka.jsp file. And then what I'll do is I'll just copy this particular code and then I'll paste it over here. So don't worry, I'm going to explain you what's happening. Right, so I'm basically using form method post, right? So after the page loads, you basically have to choose the action details. That will be a method that I'll use in the form controller class. And then over there, we get an option of enter customer name, where the input text will be customer name, or we can say CNAME, and an enter customer email address. So our input text will be email, and then that is C email. I've mentioned input text to be email because, then it will not allow any user to enter anything if that particular email address does not have an address sign. So that is basically enter customer name and customer email address. So we can similarly do that for customer ID also. So I'll mention customer ID also. So I'll just mention enter customer ID. Let's say input text, and I'll mention CID. This is basically our Edureka customers file. Now after that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically create a new file that is the view customers page, right? So this is basically the page which will be called when the customer submits his details, right? So after that, I'll just right click over here, go to new, go to example, and over here I'll mention JSP. All right, there's nothing happening, so let's just try again. I'll go to others and then I'll go to JSP. Right, I'll go to file and then I'll go to new, and then over here what I'll do is I'll mention view customers and then I'll click on finish. Right, so we basically have an Edureka page and then we have a view customers page. Now what I'll do is I'll basically mention the customer ID, customer name, and customer email ID objects in this particular section, right? So what I'll do is I'll just copy it from over here and then I'll just paste it over here, right? So as you can see on my screen, our H1 will be view customer details, where details are submitted as follows. That is customer name will be this, customer email ID will be this, and so on. We'll mention for the customer ID also. So I'll just mention customer ID, and then over here I'll just mention CID. Over here I'll mention CNAME, and over here I'll mention CEmail. Right, after that I'll just save this file. Now after that is done, what we have to do is we have to configure our form.controller file, right? So over here if you see, we haven't done anything. That is, we haven't done anything to accept the request from the client, and neither we have done anything to return the requested response. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure the controller class. So to configure the controller class, what I'm going to do is initially I'm going to use the get mapping annotation to get the requested mapping. As you use the requested mapping also, when you say requested mapping, you request for a specific URL, right? But when you say get mapping, you have to use the exact text that has been mentioned, right? So I'll just mention get mapping, right? And let's say I mention Edureka, right? So I'll just retrieve this particular annotation. And once I retrieve this particular annotation, we have a method which says public string edureka, and then we have to return edureka.jsp file. So that's how basically we're getting the submission form, and then the user can enter the details. Now, once the user enters the details, the user can see the details also, right? So for that, we have to call the view customers JSP. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another mapping, that is the @post mapping, right? So this is used once you're done with the URL, right? And then we'll mention details. And over there, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call in new method, let's say public string, let's say view details. And in brackets, what I'll do is I'll pass the requested parameters like, customer ID, customer name, and customer email ID. Now, after that, what I'm going to do is basically that, I'm going to pass the requested parameters so that we see it in the URL, right? So what happens is that, let's say I'm the customer. So I'm customer ID with number 1 with the name Sahiti, and then I have an email address sahiti@edureka.co. Right now, what I'm going to do is once I enter the details and I click on submit form, what happens is that automatically I'll be redirected to the view customer details, which will display my ID, my name, and my email address in the URL, right? So to do that, what I'll do is I'll mention public string view details, that is basically a method, and then I'll use the request parameter annotation, and then in the brackets I'll mention CID, and then I'll mention, let's say, int CID. Similarly, what I'll do is I'll do it for CNAME and CEmail address also. So I'll just copy paste this. I'll mention string, and then I'll mention CNAME, Over here also I'll mention CNAME. And similarly, we do the same thing for email address, right? So I'll mention email and I'll mention email. Now, once that is done, let me just import the required libraries for the request parameter. And once that is done, what I'm trying to do over here is that, I'm basically creating a model map, right? So I'll mention model map and then I'll create an object of model map, right? Now, after that is done, I have to import the annotation for this also. So let me just import the annotation for model map. And it says that, create a class of int. Okay, maybe it has to be string because string has to be passed. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically, put the model map, right? So whatever model map that I've created, that is for the CID, CNAME and email, I have to put it over there. That is basically the customer ID must be stored in customer ID, customer name must be stored in customer name, and customer email must be stored in the customer email, right? So to save your details, you have to mention model map dot put, right? And in the key and value, we mention CID. I'm sorry, it has to be in small case, and value will be CID. Similarly, I'll do it for CNAME and CEmail, right? So let me just do the same. Now, once everything is done, what we want is we want to return the view customers JSP file, right? So for that, we'll mention return, and in quotes, we'll mention the file name, that is view customers, right? Now, after that is done, I'll basically close the brackets and then I'll click on save. And once I click on save, you can see that, we're done with the form controller class. Now, next, what you have to do is you have to go back to your submission form application, and then you have to make sure that, you use the @component scan annotation to make sure that, every component is scanned. So basically, as the name suggests, this particular annotation is used to scan every component. So I'm just going to copy paste the code where we're basically, building a Spring application builder. So that's basically where we're configuring the Spring application builder. And also this particular class must extend the Spring Servlet class, right? So I'll just mention Spring Boot Servlet Initializer, right? So I'll just paste it over here, right? And then let's just import the required libraries for it, right? Okay, I see there's an error of bracket. So let me just include the bracket. I think error must be resolved now. Okay, what is the problem over here? Oh, it says Edureka. It's just Spring. Oh, I'm sorry. Just give me a second over here. Right, so the class name is forms application, and then I think we are good to go. Right, so I think we've resolved all the errors. So what basically happened over here is that, that we have used the @components annotation, which basically configures the component scanning directives for the use with configuration classes. So it basically provides support to scan every component that we want to scan. And then what we've done is we've basically protected the Spring application builder, and then we have configured the application for it, and then we return the application.sources file, that is the submission form applications class. After that, we have the run file, which basically says that, we need to execute over here. So if you clearly observe over here, before I execute the code, let me just discuss what I've done over here. So let me just open all the files, right? So starting with the application properties.file. So basically I've mentioned configured that we should run on port number 8084, and then we have a prefix for pages, that is basically our folder name, and then our suffix will be .jsp. After that, what we've done is we have configured the edureka.jsp file, where we've mentioned the form method to be post, that is with action details. Like, once the URL gets executed, we need the form to be displayed with enter customer ID, customer name, and customer email address. Right now, after that is done, we've configured the view customer JSP. That is basically once the customer enters his or her details, he or she should view her details, right? So that is where we have mentioned this particular details in view customer details, that, these objects are picked from the edureka.jsp file and automatically are returned. Now coming to the controller file, what I've done in controller file is that, I've initially made sure that, the Spring Boot identifies this particular class as a controller. And then I've used the get mapping annotation to get the URL for this particular URL. So when I type in localhost colon 8084/edureka, it should return the edureka.jsp file, which will basically return our form. After the details are entered, we have to go to the details action where, we take in the request parameter of the customer ID, customer name, and email and display it in the URL. And automatically the view customers JSP file is displayed. So that's how, guys, basically you can create a submission form. Now let me just execute this particular project. So I'll just right click over here, go to run as, and then choose Spring Boot app. Alright, so as we can see that Tomcat has started on port number 8084. Let's just check. So I'll just tap 8084 and then I'll mention Edureka. Oh, I'm sorry, what was it? It was /edureka, right? Okay, it has to be only edureka over here. So I'll just close this particular application again. And over here also, I'll just remove the .jsp annotation. So let me just relaunch this particular project. Right, so as we can see, Tomcat has started. So let me just go back to my URL and then I'll refresh this particular URL. And we see an output of, enter customer ID, customer name, and email address, right? So I'll just mention customer ID to be 1. Let's say I mention the name to be Sahiti. And then I'll mention sahiti@edureka.co. After that, I'll click on submit. Once I click on submit, you can see the details that, the URL has changed to localhost colon 8084/details, where the view customer JSP has been returned, which shows the details that the user has entered. So that's how, guys, basically you can create a simple submission form. Now, if you observe in this particular application, the details entered by the user are not getting stored anywhere, right? So if you observe, I'm entering any detail, right? It's not getting stored anywhere. So where do we store it? So we need a database for it. So next in this session, let's look into how to connect the web application to a database. So I'm going to show you step by step how we are going to use the H2 database and the JPA repositories to connect the web application to the database. But before that, let me tell you that the H2 database is the in-memory database, whereas the Spring Data JPA basically deals with enhanced support for JPA-based data access layers. So it basically makes it easier to build Spring-powered applications that use the data access technologies. So now let me just quickly shift back to my Eclipse IDE and then let's just extend this particular project itself. Right, so over here, before I get started with the configuration part, let me just open the pom.xml file and show you the required dependencies. So as you saw, only I had taken the com.h2 database dependency, but yes, if you have not taken it before, you can just copy the dependency details from the Maven repository itself and paste it over here. The same goes for the data JPA. Now, after this is done, what I'm going to do is basically, we have to configure the application properties file, start using the H2 in-memory database. Right, so to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mention spring.h2.console.enabled equal to true, which is basically that we are enabling our H2 database, and then we have to make sure that we mention the platform, right? So you can have any number of databases like MySQL, Oracle, PostgreSQL, and so on. But yes, in this session, I'm going to use the in-memory database. So I'm going to use the H2 database. So over here, I'll again mention spring.datasource.platform equal to H2. Now, after that is done, what you can basically mention is basically our URL. That will be a URL through which you can connect to our H2 in-memory database, right? So for that, you'll mention spring.datasource.url equal to JDBC. You'll mention H2. You'll mention MEM, and then you can mention whatever you want to mention the database name, right? So let's say we mention list of customers. And then what I'm going to do is I'll just relaunch this particular application. Now, once I relaunch this particular application, what I'm going to do is I'll just go to localhost colon 8084 and then I'll mention H2 console. Right, so once I mention H2 console, you see this web page that opens up which says driver class org.h2.driver, where JDBC URL is JDBC H2 MEM and list of courses that we had just mentioned. So by default, the username and password will be the same. You do not have to change it. But yes, if you want to change it, you can go forward and change. And then what I'll do is I'll just click on connect. So we see that, not found. It says that, it is not found. So we can't auto create. Right. So over here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to test the connection. So I'm sorry over here. My database name was list of customers and I've mentioned list of courses over here. So I'll mention list of customers and then I'll click on connect. Now, once I click on connect, you automatically see that, you'll be redirected to this particular page where you have information schema, users, and all. Now, over here, if you see, you do not have anything, right? You do not have a table for our customers, right? So basically what happens is when you enter the customer ID, customer name, and email address, your data must be stored in a table. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my file over here. And then what I'll do is I'll create a new file over here which says customers.java. So I'll just go over here and then I'll mention customers. I'll click on finish. And in this particular file, what I'm going to do is I'll just mention private int CID and private int CNAME and private int CEmail. Now after that, I'll just generate the getter setter methods for these, right? So I'll just choose source and then choose generate getter setter methods, and then I'll select all, click on generate, right? So I'll just copy this, put it over here so that there's no confusion. And now what I'll do over here is basically that, I'll use the @entity annotation to create an entity, right? So basically with this particular annotation, what happens is that automatically the table will be created when you run this particular project, right? And then what happens is that in the customers class, I'll mention @ID. So the same goes over here. We'll just import the required libraries. And one thing over here, we had to change it to string because CNAME and CEmail are not integer values, but they're string values. So I'll just mention it to string. Okay, I'm sorry, it has to be email, right? And over here, it has to be string over here and also over here. I'll just change the spelling so that there's no confusion further. And I'll just remove this part. Right now, after this is done, what I'm going to do is I'll just generate the strings. So I'll select again, go to source, I'll generate to string, I'll click on generate, I'll copy the section, and then what I'll do is I'll just paste it over here. Right, so I hope this part is clear to you guys. All right, so there are a few errors. Let's see what that is. Okay, that's because of the spelling mistake. So that is C email, and this is C email also over here. All right, I'll just change it to string over here. The same goes over here. We need to change it to string, and then I'll click on save. Now what I'm going to do is I'll just relaunch this particular application, right? So let's just relaunch this application. And then once the application is relaunched, you can see that, Tomcat has started on port number 8084. And then I click on connect. Right after that, you can see that, automatically a table has been created with the name customers. That is basically our class name was customers. That is now the table name, and it has attributes CID, CEmail, and CNAME. So if you observe over here, if I just type in select star from customers and I run this particular query, you see that, there are no rows present, right? But yes, if I just insert anything, let's say I just insert localhost. Let's say I enter a few details. Let's say one, I mentioned Sahiti, and I mentioned Sahiti@edureka.co. I submit. We can view the details as customer ID, customer name, and email address. Now, if I just refresh the database and then run this query again, we see that, the data is still not getting stored into the database. Now that is because, the application is very well connected into the database, but yes, we have not defined how to add the data into the database, right? So next in the session, let's understand how to add the data into the database from the application. Now to pass the data from web application to the database, what you have to do is you have to create a repository. So to create a repository, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click over here, go to new, and then I'll choose interface, right? And in interface, let's say I mention the name to be customers repo. I'll click on finish after that. Right now, once this is done, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to extend the CRUD repository, right? So I'll just mention extends repository, and in brackets, I'll just mention customers. That is basically a customers class and an integer. All right, integer has to be caps, and I think we have created the repository. So what I'm doing over here is that, the JPA repository and CRUD repositories are few repositories through which you can extend the interface action. So basically, I'm trying to extend those methods and functionalities present in these repositories to perform few tasks. So what's basically happening over here is that, I'm extending the customer repo repository with another interface, that is the CRUD repository. And I'm telling the Spring over here is that, it is responsible to work with the customers class, and the primary key will be the integer value. That is basically a customer ID. So that's what I'm going to do right now over here. And now after that, what I'm going to do is I just have to edit my form controller file. So over here, if you observe, we've got the get mapping edureka, and then we used a method to return the edureka JSP file. Similarly, after post mapping, we return the view customer details, right? Now, after viewing the customer details, I want the details to be stored into the H2 database. Now, how do you think that can happen? Well, to do that, what you initially have to do is you have to use the repository, right? So to do that, what I'm going to do over here is basically that, I'm going to use the @autowired annotation. And then I'm going to automatically get all the auto configurations for it, right? So I'm just going to use the @autowired annotations. And once I've used the @autowired annotation, the next step is to basically mention the customer repository that we just created, right? So for that, what you'll do is you'll just mention customer repo, and then you'll mention repo, right? So this is basically the repository that we just created. And repo is basically to perform actions, right? So we're going to use this particular variable to perform actions, right? After that, what I'm going to do over here is that, I'm just going to use the same thing. So I'll just copy paste this particular section. And let's say I do request mapping. So even if I just type in localhost colon 8084, I want the URL to be working. And then what I'm going to do is I'll just return the form itself, right? So for that, I'll just mention customers and customers. We're going to return the Edureka JSP file. So when we request this particular URL, we return Edureka page. Right now, after that is done, the next thing that we want to do is when details are fetched, when the URL changes to details. So if you remember, when I enter the user details and then when I view the customer details, what we see is that URL is localhost colon 8084 slash details, where we return the view customer.jsp file, right? So for that, what I'm going to do over here, I'm just going to copy paste this particular section, right? And I'll just paste it over here, and over here I'll mention details. And over here, what I'm going to do is I'll just return Edureka, but yet I'll just use repo.save. And over here, I'll mention customers, right? So I'll just mention customers over here. And one thing over here is that, if you use it twice, I don't think this is required over here because we are just trying to return our form over here. But yes, over here, what we are trying to return is basically that, whenever the details are fetched and when the details are entered, we have to save it to a repository, right? So for that, we need an object over here that is customers. So this is basically a class name and this is basically the object name which we will use to save the file. Now, after that is done, the next thing that I want to do is basically I want to view the details. So to view the details, what I'm going to do is I'll just copy paste this particular section over here. I'll just get details and I'll just remove this particular section. And what I'll do is I'll remove this particular section also, and I'll mention view customers. Right, so I hope this part is clear to you guys. And over here, what I'll do is I'll just mention the method's name. So over here, I'll just change it to details. And let's say I change it to get details over here. Right, so I hope this part is clear over here. Now, I don't think this part is required, so we can just remove this particular part. And after the post mapping is done, that is after the URL changes to get details, now instead of details, what we want is we basically want to get the request parameter of customer ID. And then we need the ability to find the customer with the help of an ID, right? Now, let's say, I'll just comment out this particular section and let's see what happens, right? So what I'm going to do is I'll just execute this particular section. So I'll just relaunch this particular form and let's see what happens. What do we get in our outputs? Right, so we see that the application has started. So now let's say I go to localhost 8084 without any URL. You can see that we get enter customer ID, customer name, and email. So I'll just mention the same. So and then I'll click on submit. Now once I click on submit, you see that the post mapping is not done properly because the post mapping has been removed. But yet if we go to our H2 console and let's say I do select star from customers and then I connect again, and let's say I mention again select star from customers, and let's say I run this particular query, we see that the data is not inserted yet. Okay, my bad, this particular method has to be details again. Right, and now let's say I relaunch this particular application. Let's see what happens, right? So let's just relaunch this particular application. And what I'll do is I'll just go to localhost 884. I'm sorry, I'll go to localhost 884. I'll mention customer ID 1, name and email to be this. I'll click on submit. And once I click on submit, you again see an error that there's a problem with the mapping. Now the error that we were facing was that the data that the user enters was not getting stored at all, right? That was because we had put the @AutoWhite annotation below the customer repository repo statement. So please remember that you have to put this annotation before the customer repo statement because after that everything gets auto configured automatically in Spring Boot, right? So you basically have to make sure that the repository is taken into account and then the @AutoWhite annotation is above this particular statement. So what I'm going to do is I'll just relaunch this particular application again. Right now, once the application is relaunched, let's just go back to our URL. And what I'll do is I'll just mention localhost 8084. Right, I'll mention customer ID 1, customer name Sahiti, and the email address to be sahiti@edureka.co. Once you hit on submit, you see that you're redirected to localhost colon 8084 slash details, which is again the form itself, right? Now let's say that you want to view the customer details. So if you observe over here, to view the customer details, we're given the URL of get details, right? So I'll just mention get details over here. Now, if you observe over here, we see no output over here. That was because, our post mapping annotation is not working. But if you go back to your H2 console, and then if you type in select star from customers, you see that, CID, email and CNAME have been mentioned, where, our CID is 1, email is sahiti@edureka.co, and CNAME is Sahiti, right? So that's what we mentioned, right? So that means our data is getting passed from our web application, our data is getting stored. But the problem is data is not coming into the next page where we want to view the customer details, right? So to do that, we have to enable the @post mapping annotation. And then what I'm going to do is I'll just comment out this particular section. And once I comment out this particular section, the next thing that you have to do is you have to create a model and a view, right? So our post mapping annotation will be used and the URL will be get details. And over here, what I'll do is I'll mention model and view. And over here, let's say I mention get details to be the method name. And in the request parameter, what I'm going to do is I'm going to search by the customer ID, right? So I'm going to search, or maybe I want to view the customer details with the help of the customer ID. So I'll just mention customer ID and I'll remove everything else from over here, right? So I'll just remove this part. And next, what I'll do is I'll mention model and view over here. So I'll just mention model and view MB equal to new model and view. So this is similar to the previous example that we had seen. And over here, we'll use a new JSP file, which is the retrieve data JSP file. So over here, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to retrieve the data from the database, right? Till now, what was happening was that, we had a web application, we had a database, and the data was getting stored from the web application to the database. So if you had to check the data, then you have to go to the database. Now what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to retrieve the data from the database and then display into the web page, which has the URL localhost colon 8084 slash get details. So what I'll do is I'll just mention retrieve.jsp. But over here, I don't think JSP is required to mention. So I'll just mention retrieve. But over here, the only problem is that, we do not have a retrieve.jsp file, right? So first, let me just initially create a retrieve.jsp file. But before that, let me just import the model and view. So what I'm going to do is I'll go back over here. I'll mention new and then I'll mention other. And over here, I'll mention JSP. I'll click on file. I'll click on next. And over here, let's say I mention retrieve, right? So I'll mention the name and then I'll click on finish. Now, once I click on finish, what I'm going to do is I'll just mention the H1 to be retrieve customer details, and details are submitted as follows. And over here, I'll just retrieve the object customers. Now, after that, let's come back to the form controller. And the next thing that you have to do is basically that, you have to remove all this part. And then what you have to do is you have to use the customers object. So you'll type in customers and then you'll mention customers equal to repo dot find by ID, right? So that's what basically we're trying to find. We're trying to find with the customer ID. So that is CID. And just in case if the customer is not present, let's say we have a customer ID 5 and that's not present, that record is deleted from the table, you'll just get an output of or else null, right? So in case in a scenario where the customer ID is not present, we'll get an output as null. So it shows an error. Let's see why the error is. Okay, it says the method find by integer in type is not applicable for string. Okay, my bad. Sorry, it has to be of int type because customer ID is of integer type. So the next thing that you have to do is you have to basically add the object, right? So for that, you'll choose mb.add object. And after that, what you're going to do is you have to return this particular object, that is return mb. Right, so I hope this part is clear to you guys. Okay, I see an error. Oh, I'm sorry, I should not be capital over here. Right, and then I'll click on save. If I make you go through the form controller, then what we're doing is that, when we request the mapping slash, then when I say localhost colon 8084, the form should be retrieved from the edureka.jsp file. After that, if I say localhost colon 8084 slash details, the form should be again retrieved, and also the data entered by the customers must be stored in the H2 database. After that, if I mention request mapping slash get details, so if I mention get details, I need to go to the view customers page. After I map with the get details, what must happen is that, the data must be retrieved from the H2 database. So over here, what I'm trying to do is I have specific amount of records in my database. Now, what I want to do is I want to retrieve that particular customers. Let's say I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 customers, right? I want to retrieve the third one's data. So I'll just choose the customer ID tree, and then automatically the data must be retrieved. So for that, I've chosen another JSP file, that is retrieve.jsp, which I've just created, and then it will retrieve the customer's object. So I hope the flow is clear to you guys. So now what I'm going to do is I'll just relaunch this application again. So you can see that, the Tomcat has started on port number 884. So what I'll do is I'll go to Edureka customers, and let's say I remove the details part. So we go to our get a form. So over here I can mention customer ID, let's say Sahiti, and I'll mention sahiti@edureka.co. I'll click on submit. Similarly, I'll mention to, let's say Sanjana, and then I'll mention sanjana@edureka.co, and then I'll click on submit. Right now what I'll do is I'll go back to my H2 console, and then what I'll do is I'll just choose select star from customers. If I click on run, I have to connect again. So I'll connect again, and then I'll mention select star from customers. Right, I'll click on run, and then you can see we have two records, right? That is customer ID with 1 and 2. Now what I'll do is I'll just click on get details, and over here we see basically that, view customer details. The details submitted are as follows, that is customer ID, email, and name. Okay, so this is one of the biggest mistake that I've been doing for quite a long of time, that, I haven't configured the form of view customer details to enter the customer ID. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So I'll just go back to my Eclipse workspace. I'll close over here. Now what I'll do is I'll go to view customers, and now in the view customers page, what I'll do is I'll just remove all these details, right? I'll just remove all this part, and then I'll just paste this one, that is, form action get details. That is because, we have been calling the get details method, but yes, I forgot to configure the view customers form. So that's my bad. I'm sorry for that. Now that I've configured the form, so over here I have the form action to be get details, the method to be post, and then input number type to be customer ID. So what I'll do is as soon as the customer ID is entered, what will happen is that, automatically the get details form will open up where we'll see the customer ID details. So let's just relaunch the application again. All right, so as you can see, the application has started. Now again, what I'll do is I'll go to 884. I'll mention customer ID, let's say it's Sahiti, and this submit. Similarly, I'll mention to customer name to be Sanjana, sanjana@edureka.co, submit. What I'll do is I'll click on run, then I'll connect to the H2 database again. I'll mention select star from customers. I'll click on run. Now after that, what we'll do is we'll just go to get details, right? And then we see an option of view customer details. So I'll just mention one over here, and if I click on submit, we see that, we see an error of white label error page. That is basically our retrieve option is not working properly, right? So let's see how to get it corrected. So the error was basically, guys, that I had mentioned the customer ID object to be wrong. So in my form, if you see, it was CID, right? So if I go to my customers class over here, you can see that, I have CID, but yet I had mentioned customer ID. So I just changed it to CID. And now if we just execute this project again, you'll see that, it will work absolutely fine, right? So let's just execute this project again, right? So let's just wait for it to execute. Right, so you can see that, Tomcat has started on port number 8084. So what I'll do is I'll enter the customer ID and customer name and let's say email address. Similarly, I'll mention another customer ID and customer name, and then I'll click on submit. After that, I'll click on H2 console, and I'll just select this part. I'll click on run. You have to connect again, so we'll connect again. And then if I click on run selected, you can see that, I have the CID, C email, and C name. Now let me go to localhost :884 / get details. Right, if I click on get details, let's say, if I want to check the details for the first one, that is for Sahiti, right? So I'll mention CID, that is 1. I'll click on submit, and if I click on submit, you can see an output that, CID equal to 1, C name is Sahiti, and C email as sahiti@edureka.co, right? So if I go back again, and if I just mention 2 over here and click on submit, you see that the details have changed and the CID is 2. C name is Sanjana, and C email as sanjana@edureka.co. Right, now if I go back and change 3, please remember that, we only have 2 records and we do not have the third record. What we can do is if I click on submit, you'll see that, the application has no explicit mapping. So guys, you can take forward this example, and then you can go forward and configure your application to all such scenarios where, the data is missing, or maybe you have to enter data and so on. So guys, with this, we come to an end to this particular section on how to connect your application with database and how to fetch data from the database. So I hope that we have understood how we have done that. Now, before I move forward with the next part of today's session, I would like to tell you that, you can also use Spring Boot to manipulate the query methods, right? So you can try to use query methods to retrieve data as per your requirement. So I'm not going to go into that part. I would like you to go and try yourself. If you have any doubts in that part of the section, you can comment down in the comment section below, and then we'll get back to you with a solution.